You're listening to Leading Up with Udemy. This podcast is your guide to developing your skills as an emerging or seasoned leader. I'm Alan Todd, your host and the Vice President of Leadership Development at Udemy. Together, we can work, lead, and live differently to create a better world. This week, I'm speaking with Jessica Michaels, an award-winning speaker, former stand-up comic, and renowned expert in leadership development. In her 30s, she discovered she had autism and ADHD. Through the process of discovery and deep reflection, she's become an expert teacher and coach on supporting neurodiversity in the workplace. With humor and directness, she shows her audiences how every employee benefits from a neuro-inclusive environment. Through her YouTube channel, podcast, and coaching, she provides insights and advice to create a more neurodiverse workplace. She also has a very highly rated course on Udemy to teach leaders how to unlock high performance in employees with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and other neurodivergencies. I was excited to have Jessica Michaels on the podcast this week. I think it's really powerful how she describes neurodiversity, on how you use that to create a better workplace, a more innovative workplace, better management, more inclusive. I think we can all benefit from the power of perspective and understanding different life experiences and people with different backgrounds and ways of thinking. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's talk about this eclectic journey of yours, Jessica. And let's go back to your first job and tell us how it all came about.
Yeah, so I started my professional career back when you applied for jobs in the newspaper, and they didn't pay always very much to post the ads, so they weren't super descriptive. So I showed up for an interview one day, and it turns out it was at a recruiting company, and I didn't know how fortuitous that would be, but I ended up learning how to interview people, what hiring managers were looking for, what professional expectations were in the workplace, a lot of things that I hadn't been exposed to. And that was a really great start for me as I went through my career into sales and leadership, and I was able to use that knowledge that I had gained. Now, the problem was when I did get those promotions into leadership, that is kind of when the wheels would come off. I was a great individual contributor, but when I was leading a team, I found that what I thought I was putting into the team for them to experience was the opposite of what they were feeling. And that repeated itself a couple of times. And as somebody who was used to succeeding, that was really frustrating for me.
How did those positions come to an end then? So there were multiple times where you got promoted into leadership. Did they end in like a blow up or something?
Let's see. Once I got laid off, but I was first on the chopping block where I probably wouldn't have been had I been doing a good job. And then other times I just found that I was encouraged to look for other options. And then once I was fired, I just didn't understand. I did not understand. But I'm a teacher and a learner, so I studied and I took every communication class, every emotional intelligence class, anything related to management and leadership. And it was still happening. The same pattern repeated itself. And that's when I realized that, okay, it must be me. There's no more knowledge out there that is going to help me. And that sent me to a psychologist. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that it was something that I could hopefully learn about myself. And that's when I found out that I was autistic and ADHD. But all of that information I had gotten in my very first job about hiring and recruiting and interviewing, that is what had allowed me to operate in my career for 20 years before I found out that I was neurodivergent.
So I want to back up. In 2 or 3 different occasions, you became a manager or a leader of other people. Did you want to be a leader? Like, how did you become a leader? You wanted to be, you tried to be. How'd that happen?
Yes. So The way we promote people to management right now is you're a great individual contributor, and then there's nowhere to go. And so promotion to management is the next step. Now, what the problem is, often all of the things that make you a great individual contributor often are opposite of the skills that will make you a good leader. And that's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah. And then the other thing is you read all the books. I remember you Run Minute Manager, everything, Who Moved My Cheese. You read them all. Did you try to apply those things? I'm just trying to get a sense of, before you discovered neurodiversity, you read these books and you go apply them, which is what we all do. And what happened when you tried to apply these new principles and practices from the leadership industry?
Right. Well, there's a few problems that got in my way that I didn't know that existed. One is when I was trying to apply these principles, the way I communicate and perceive emotion is different than other people. So, for example, I would ask my employee, "Hey, how are you doing?" And they would say, "Fine." And I would go, "Great, you're fine." And then I would move on. And kind of a quote unquote normal person in that situation would go, "Okay, fine. Well, what was the look on their face when they said it? What was the tone of their voice when they said it?" And those aren't things that my brain really picks up on or processes. So I'm dependent on people telling me truly how things are because I don't understand the subtext. There's some political things in the workplace too that I didn't recognize. Somebody would say, "Hey, your team can pick up this project if you want, but if you're too taxed right now, then we can give it to somebody else." And I would go, "Great," not realizing that the fact that they were talking to me about the project meant that really was something that my team needed to pick up in that environment. So there were things that I was missing. And then the other thing is I express emotion differently. So in my head, I am communicating clearly that I care very much about my team and I care very much about them as people. And I am really supportive and encouraging, but the way that they heard it because of the way I expressed myself wasn't the way that I intended. So it was like if you took and interviewed my team and me about the job that they were doing and I was doing, it would sound like we were working at two different companies. That's how far apart we were. So those are things that got in my way.
Now let's go back to, you went to see a psychologist and what happened next?
Yes. So I got the diagnosis of ADHD and autism. And I thought, great. Well, clearly, if there's a name for this, then there must be a cure. Because at the time I thought, oh, this must be a disease. This is something that I can fix, though. And so I thought the next step was like a pill or, a cream or something that I could use and that would make me, again, as I perceived it, normal. But of course, as I learned more, I learned that one, this isn't an illness. This is a neurodevelopmental disorder that has been present in my brain since birth and will continue to be with me as long as I live. And I learned that essentially I was viewing and experiencing the world differently than even the person right next to me. And that's a tough realization to come to, and it's hard to process that. You can have different physical feelings. You might sense temperature differently and light differently, but it all made sense when I look back across my life. Now, the most challenging part for me, because this came out of me wanting to be better at work, was that the resources that are available for people with these diagnoses are primarily geared towards children. And there wasn't much for me. I was recommended to join a social skills class, and I waited 2 years for that to be available. And when I went, it was all young people, and they were practicing things like ordering in a restaurant. And that was all that was there for me. So that's when I really came to the realization that I need to figure this out on my own. And it took a long time for me to figure things out, and still definitely a work in progress. But that was kind of where the coach in me and the learning and development side of me came into play once I felt like I had a handle professionally on what I was doing. And I thought, oh boy, I need to help people, because this is 20 to 30% of the world who right now doesn't have a lot of resources. So how can I help?
And I think that's something that people don't realize. 20% to 30% globally, people identify as neurodiverse. So can you give us a definition? What does neurodiverse mean? A practical working workplace definition for a leader to understand what it means.
Absolutely. So, the concept behind neurodiversity is that all brains are different. Neuro, brain, diversity, different. I find it's helpful to think of people's brains as cell phones, right? Because you think all cell phones make calls, can go on the internet, send text messages and things. But there are two main types of cell phones, right? There's Androids and there's iPhones. Now, iPhones are the majority, let's say. And because they are the majority, the world has sort of been built for iPhones. So iPhones are things that people can use really easily. They can communicate with one another easily. And even though people may use them for different things, they all work the same hardware and they have the same operating system. Now, these Androids on the other side here, those are still phones. They still can do a lot of the same things that iPhones do, with some differences. But the way they accomplish those tasks is very different, because they run a totally different operating system. And they have a different set of hardware. They're not interchangeable. So if we think of brains, then, if we think of our iPhones as what we would call neurotypical, which just means people's brains work the way that you would expect. And then the Androids are neurodivergent people, the people whose brains work differently and are a minority compared to the iPhone group. And we think of things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia. Those are the three main identities that fall under neurodivergence, but there are others. And that's not a medical definition, it's a social definition. So it's really shifting every day, and more things are getting added to that neurodivergent bucket as we figure out all the different ways, that a person's brain can be affected to work differently.
Yeah. And I think you said something before that I forget how you said it, but maybe you could try to recollect it for me. But it was something like, I'm not broken. This isn't a disorder. It's just different. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, one of the tenets of the neurodiversity theory is that people who have these different brains, that's not inherently bad. The challenge is that the world, again, is built for iPhones. But if they were in a world that was geared more towards them, if we had a more Android-based society, then we would be able to function just fine. One of the interesting things is that when neurodivergent people get together, we tend to be able to communicate very easily with each other. My spouse, we found out, is neurodivergent, and that's not uncommon when one friend finds out they're neurodivergent and others start to explore, because we find each other, because we communicate and we understand each other the same way, as opposed to neurotypical people maybe who kind of feel like we're weird or there's something off or something that they don't understand about us. So left to our own devices, most of us do quite well.
I love your analogy with iPhone and Android, because one is not better than the other. They're just different. And what's kind of exciting about all of this is, and I've seen a number of studies, but I saw a Deloitte study that showed that neurodiverse teams are 30% more productive. They drive more innovation. They create stronger competitive advantages than non-diverse ones. So I'd love to hear, why do you think that is?
So I think the power of perspective is often overlooked. When you have people who are on a team who have different life experiences, that have different priorities, that tend to notice different things. Their brains pick up. Maybe somebody is a better pattern recognizer and someone is a better innovator and someone's a better imagination person. Then all of those things together benefit the team and the output. I think we do tend to focus on, in the diversity world, on that outcome. I would be remiss if I left out the fact that it does take work to get to that point. I think that's why people don't take advantage of the knowledge that diverse teams do perform better, is because on day one, that team is not going to perform very well. It takes a lot of time and you make a lot of mistakes, but the payout is huge. As you mentioned, 30% increase in productivity. It's just not every team is willing to do what it takes to get there.
Yeah, and I want to unpack that a little bit, but before we do, I want to stay with the thread about why this is better, why one is not better. iPhone is not better than Android in your analogy, but combined, we can create something interesting. And I saw something, Richard Branson from Virgin, serial entrepreneur, has done all these great things. And he wrote in his blog, the world needs a neurodiverse workforce to help try and solve some of the big problems of our time. So my question for you is, how can a neurodiverse team solve really complex problem better?
One of the ways is there is a term called Spiky profile. And basically what that means is that if you have somebody who is neurotypical, we expect that how somebody performs on one task is indicative of how they will perform on another task. So you hire somebody into your company, maybe as an admin or as a business development rep, but with training and experience, we think, oh, they can probably promote it into sales or customer service, or, because how somebody performs in that first business development role often indicates how they're going to do in subsequent places in their career. And that's what our hiring model really is built on. We think that we get employees in and we can plug and play, but there's a baseline for those individuals. Neurodivergent brains have what we call a spiky profile, meaning how somebody performs on a task is not indicative of how they will do on something that we would think would be related. So somebody might be a good business development rep, but then we get them to being an account rep, and maybe they aren't able to manage kind of the long-term aspect of that relationship, or it just doesn't sit right. But maybe there is an element of that job that they aren't just good at, they are insanely good at. They are exceptional. So when you think of people like Simone Biles and Richard Branson and Sir Anthony Hopkins and these people, when I would ask in a training room, hey, wouldn't you love to have any one of these people on your team? And everyone go, yes, I would love to have these people. It's like, okay, but those people wouldn't succeed in the environment that you have set up right now, because you right now are only built for the people who kind of function at that predictable baseline, not for these people who have very high spiky talents, but also corresponding lower areas of challenge. You think that if somebody has an area of challenge, well, then there must not be a layer of exceptional, thinking there, or that area of challenge disqualifies them from being able to contribute in the place where they are exceptional. Neurodiverse teams that make it so that everybody is allowed to work to their strengths, well, then they do have the ability to take advantage of the Richard Bransons of the world, the Simone Biles of the world, who have these amazing, amazing talents. And that's what puts them head and shoulders above other teams that don't make those allowances.
So companies that have implemented neurodiversity in hiring, I've seen Microsoft, JP Morgan Chase, SAP, and they've seen significant improvements in productivity and innovation. So they've seen really good results. What do they get right and what do others get wrong in searching for this spiky profile?
Well, let's start right at the interview. Let's start in the recruiting process. So, if you think of an interview, what are things that we look for? Well, yes, we talk about the job, but we look at things like how's their eye contact, right? Because that's a sign of professionalism. Do people have a good handshake? Do people ask the right questions? We know that there's a magic formula. You don't ask about salary on the first interview, and there's those things that are never expressly stated. But to us, those are all a part of being professional. And if people come in and are looking at the floor or are looking up, and somebody maybe is rocking in their chair and doesn't have a good handshake, and then asks about time off and asks about seating arrangements in the interview, you're going to think, well, that person is not a fit. That person is not professional, no matter how good their skills are. When you are recruiting for neurodiversity, you have to remember one of the things that people who are neurodivergent have differently is their ability to understand and recognize social norms and conventions. So people will say what's on their mind. So if they have a question about pay, that's what they're going to ask. I have a really hard time making eye contact. It's very difficult for me. It's actually, the sensation is painful. It's sort of like asking your candidate to sit on thumbtacks during the interview to see how much pain they can tolerate while they answer their questions. Now, does this tell you anything about me as a professional or how I do my job? Not at all. You would never ask somebody to sit on thumbtacks, but for some of these candidates, when you're asking them to make eye contact, that's exactly what you're doing, is asking them to be uncomfortable. So getting people in the door is very challenging for many reasons. And then when people are hired, they will have a different set of understandings of what the workplace environment is like and what professionalism is like. And again, you can't necessarily predict one action to the next based upon, this person is able to work at Microsoft. I shouldn't have to tell them that they can't take their shoes off and walk around the office, but maybe that's how that person thinks better. And it just never occurred to them that they wouldn't be able to walk around the office in socks, that people would be bothered by that. So it's definitely there's more latitude in working with people who are neurodivergent because you want more latitude in what they're able to contribute to your company. So I think there's a lot of elements where they just approach the world from a different perspective. And instead of creating an environment that stifles that, they create an environment that welcomes that.
So your analogy that if you look people in the eye in a first meeting is like sitting on thumbtacks, like it's that painful and draining to you. Did you teach yourself to just do it anyway so that you could fit in? And when you coach people, what did you have to go through on your own or coach people? Like, do they try and just fake it and put a good handshake and look in the eyes? And is that really hard and painful? And does it work? Can you fake it or at least try to reach some way to the other side?
Right. So there's a process that's called masking, which kind of is what it says on the label, right? That there's a different face that people will put on in different situations. Now, I know people say, oh, everybody does that. Everybody has a different face at work than you do dealing with your family. But as my wife came up with this analogy, she's like, it's sort of the difference. Like if you have one leg that's longer than the other, for some people, that difference is going to be minuscule. So that difference between your work face and your home face, that's just something that you naturally compensate for. It's not something you even notice. But for other people whose maybe one leg is 12 inches shorter than the other leg, that is going to require thought in how you approach things and deal with the world and how you compensate for that. And for people who are neurodivergent, getting themselves into a position where they are able to kind of fit in to this professional environment is very difficult. And it is painful. I trained myself to look people in the eye and count to, 7, and then look away because you don't want to stay eye contact too long because that's creepy. So you have to back off. And then, so while I'm answering these interview questions or while I'm in this professional conversation, part of my brain is also going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, look away, And so when you are asking people to put themselves in this box of what we think of as, acceptable professional behaviors, many can do that, but it's a question of how much mental and physical resource you want them to use doing that. It doesn't benefit anybody, but in many workplaces, that's what we're asked to do. And unfortunately, somebody's ability to do that is finite. If you catch me at 4:00, I can't do that anymore. I'm done. So I have to think, okay, I can't really schedule meetings at this time unless it's with somebody I really know well, because I won't be able to do the things that make me fit in to be able to have these conversations. And not everybody can mask. Often how somebody's neurodivergence affects their brain means that no matter how they try, they're still going to be different. And we shouldn't ask people, frankly, to be somebody else, to be a different person totally in order to come to work. Companies now have come as you are and bring your whole self to work, but often there's kind of a subtext there. Bring your whole self to work unless you're neurodivergent. Not like that. Don't be yourself like that. Be yourself if you're like us. Don't be yourself if you're really different.
So I think you make a really good point, which is if we asked the neurodivergent person to act like everyone else, it's placing a massive cognitive burden on them. Then that cognitive tax essentially zaps them of what they're best capable of. So you're basically sub-optimizing. Jessica, that was so helpful. Just the way you sort of think about this, your analogies. So as we wrap up here, we have a question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, what are you curious about and learning now?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, what I am learning about now is how neurodiversity is impacting our future generations. Gen Z is very neurodiversity fluent. I want to see how is Gen Alpha being raised and how they think about different people and the way different people think. So I have been spending a lot of time with young people and learning about the way they communicate. I've learned the word skibbity recently. So yes, that's my course of study.
Tell me what skibbity is.
Generally, from my understanding, it means like bad.
All right. I'll try not to be skibbity. Well, that's a great topic to focus on, Jessica, because Gen Z, I think, has surpassed baby boomers in the workplace this year. And so they are the up-and-comers in the future. Thanks again to Jessica Michaels for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks again to Jessica Michaels for joining us today on the podcast. Follow Leading Up, a podcast from Udemy Business, wherever you find your podcasts. We'll be back next Wednesday with another episode to help you level up your leadership skills. Follow the show so you never miss an episode. And if you like the show, leave a rating or a review. We'd love the feedback, and it really helps us to find new listeners. To learn more about Leading Up or how Udemy can help you develop leaders at scale and move business forward, visit business.udemy.com. The Leading Up podcast is produced in partnership with Pod People. Our original theme is by Soundboard.